Hi, I'm Chris Zaleski, and my husband Glenn and I have been attending Red Cedar since the first meeting in the park, which I believe was 25 years ago. I was raised in a faithful home where my parents taught us about tithing. I was one of 8 children, and we lived on one income, which made for tight times. But my parents were faithful in their tithing, and we witnessed their obedience each week. When Glenn and I got married, we were young and times were tight for us as well. I considered myself a believer, but I wasn't really living the life of one. Through some Christian co-workers and friends, I recommitted my life to Christ in those early years of our marriage, and I started a new journey, including taking our kids to church. Glenn was not a believer, and he wasn't raised with faith. He was raised, among other things, in a home where he experienced financial insecurity. So when I started going to church again and tithing as I was raised to do, it was met with pushback from Glenn. I was working part-time in those days, and since he didn't understand or agree with me on this issue, I decided to tithe on just my paycheck, to be obedient to God and to honor Glenn. It wasn't that he was greedy or not generous, but because our finances were tight, or up to here, as Pastor West talked about in a recent sermon, it didn't make sense to him, and it seemed counterintuitive to our circumstances of life at that time. Through lots of prayer and eventually his attendance at Promise Keepers, a men's conference, he came to know the Lord, and with this, the knowledge of what tithing was and what God's word tells us about this. Among other references, we find in Leviticus 27:30, where it says, "A tenth of the produce of the land, whether grain or fruit, is the Lord's and is holy." I personally am glad he only asks for a tenth. At this point, we started going to church regularly together and tithing. I'm thankful that we have the opportunity now to give online in these days, as it allows us to be faithful in giving our first fruits as he asks us to do. Several years ago, the church embarked on a mission to raise funds for the new church that we now enjoy. We were asked to pray about what God would have us to give above and beyond our tithe. We prayed, and when Glenn and I came together, we had the same number, so we knew that it was from the Lord. Sometime before this, an opportunity had emerged for a possible new job for myself. I didn't know how many days per week the job would be offered or what the compensation would be, but Glenn and I had talked about it, and we both decided that this was a good move for us as a family and for me in my career if it was offered. The process with this job opportunity took about 6 months, which was a lot longer than we expected. But in hindsight, I realized that God orchestrated that timing because I believe he wanted to see if we would be obedient. Only after he had given us the dollar amount for the above and beyond giving did the job offer come. The offer was 2 days less per week than my previous job, cutting my paycheck in half. The number God had given us went from being slightly uncomfortable in our life to being more uncomfortable if we took the job. We had a choice to make. We could give less than he had asked of us. We could refuse the job offer, or we could take the job and trust him and obey. We decided to trust him, though it didn't make sense on paper. Since that time, there are countless ways that God has taken care of our needs, and not just financially. He has continued to bless us to be a blessing. Wes talked about Abraham and Isaac a couple of weeks ago, and honestly, that's one of my favorite stories. Not because of the sacrifice, but because it is a reminder to me that God has a sacrificial lamb coming up the other side of the mountain, though I can't see it. I can trust that he has us covered, even when it doesn't make sense or I can't see.